new Kubernetes object called a secret. You can see it here. The secret is going to encrypt our password and store it in etcd, so it becomes part of the cluster. Switch over here and take a look at how this changes our config. Not very much. We're going to change the name from 1 to 2, and rather than having our password hard-coded right in our specification, we're going to do value from secret key ref. That secret key ref is going to be called, that secret is going to be called database password, and the key that we're interested in is going to be pass. So what I'm going to do is call up the syntax from my command history. What we're going to do is a kube control create secret generic. We're going to call it database password. That's what we're referencing here in the name. And then from literal pass is going to be my key, and we see that here. And then smile is going to be the password that I want encrypted. So now that that's created, you can see what that looks like. So my password has been encrypted here, kind of scrolled by quite quickly, but data, there's the password, kind is the secret, and then of course here's my name, and of course the namespace that we're working for. So now I can create this pod without having my password hard-coded in my configuration. Alright, so we've got our pod created there. And jump into this one. And you'll have to take my word for it. I typed smile this time instead of password, and that in fact got me in. Very similar to secrets, we can also store config information in the Kubernetes cluster, ultimately into etcd. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm going to create a config map for the name of our database so that we don't have to create the database each time. And that config map is going to store that value in etcd, and then it's going to be provided to MySQL when we start. So what we'll do is compare our last one with this one. Again, just changing from 2 to 3. Now we've got a new environmental variable called SQL_database. I'm going to use the config map, and the name is going to be database config, and my key that I want to have the value map into MySQL database is going to be called dbName. You can see the syntax for secret key ref and config key ref is very similar. So basically the same thing. The only difference is the values in the secret key ref, of course, will be encrypted, and those in the config map key ref will not. I've created a config map in YAML here with a name of database config, and I've created the database dbName info, so that info ends up in that environmental variable. This is one way to get this created. The other way is purely on the command line, and the command line provides a nice shortcut similar to the secret. I'm going to pull this back from my command history. This is the shortcut for creating the YAML file that we see up here. I can do a kube create config map database config. You can see the name is there. From literal database dbName is the key. That's the key we see here, and then info. So either way can be used to create config maps. Just use the shortcut here, flip back, and again we've got database config, so that's the one we just created, and the key db name, and the value is info, and so info is going to be loaded into MySQL underscore database when we build this pod. And we've got our pod running here. So now we want to jump into this database and see if our environmental variable was set and if SQL pulled it in and used it to automatically create info for us. I'm going to use kubectl exec again, but this time I'm going to pass it 2 dashes, which means the rest of this command should all be passed and to the container, which allows me to jump right into the SQL command asking me for the database password. And if I do show databases, you can see that we do in fact have info automatically created, since if this environmental variable is set and this database isn't created, MySQL is nice enough to create it for us. So that's one example of getting configuration information into my container. The other way also uses a config map, but a slightly different type. We're going to use a config map that's based on a file. Now, ultimately, this is still stored in etcd, but it allows you to present this in a file format rather than an environmental variable. So we've got this config map. We're going to create tuning config that's going to have the configuration information for our database, and that's going to look like a file to MySQL, which is running in the container, and that's going to be stored in this config map. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Again, changing from 3 to 4. We jump down here. Now we're getting into volumes. So what we're going to do is create that config map. So here I'm going to have a new volume. It's based on a config map that's called database-tune, and that volume in this configuration is going to be called tuningconf. That's going to be used as a volume mount in my specification, and mount path says where this will be mounted, and this name is what links these two references together. So the first thing we'll have to do is actually create the config map, and the config that I want to have in my config map is this file right here, mycnf. So it's just MySQL, some tuning parameters that I want to make sure MySQL is using. What I'm going to do is pull this command back from my command history, and we're going to do a kube create config map like before. We're going to call this one database tune. If I flip back here, database tune is the config map I'm referencing here. I'm going to say from file, and then I'm going to say where my file is. And so this is relative to where I'm running the command. And this is the command that we just looked at. Sorry, this is the config file that we just looked at. All right, so I've created this. Now we can look at how this is stored. So we've got our myconfig file. We've got a pipe dash here, and then here's the content of the file. We take a look at this guy. You can see that it is in fact the same content here. And as we'll see in a minute, this will look like a file, not a Kubernetes object, to the container, to the application running in the container in the pod. So let's go ahead and kick that off. All right, everything's running. So now we want to jump into the one we just created. And this time I'm just going to do a shell. So we want to see if our file is at this location. So let's take a look. And in fact, it is at this location. Last thing we want to do is have Kubernetes describe the pod for us. So the interesting bits here are that we've got a mount, which is etc mysql confd from tuning.conf. Tuning.conf is actually one of the volumes, so you can see that it's matched up here, and that is based on a config map, and the config map that it's based on is called database tune. The other thing to note is that our password, this environmental variable, is the key pass in the secret that we created, database password. And then of course the name of the database, MySQL database, is set to db name in the config map database config. So now we have the ability to abstract some of the configuration and insert it into our pod. Of course, our pod is still ephemeral and stateless and